MSM versus MSM, and maybe billionaire versus billionaire. I'm Scott Ott, and this is Bill Whittle Now. Bill, the big story on Drudge and everywhere else in the world today is the fact that Amazon CEO Jeff Bezos, who also happens to own the Washington Post, has decided to go public with what he would describe as an extortion letter that he received from AMI, the publisher of the National Enquirer, owned by Trump associate and friend David Pecker, the publisher there. The letter that he got from an attorney to his attorney basically said, we just posted that big expose about you, Mr. Bezos, and the affair that you're having with the married woman. We've got a lot more text messages and some pictures, but I'll tell you what, no one needs to get hurt here. You just go public and say that, in fact, you have no evidence that the National Enquirer is being pressured politically or influenced politically to publish things, specifically from Saudi Arabia or the Trump administration, and we'll just pretend these text messages and photos never happened. Bill, first of all, I just want to get your take. There's a lot of details to this, by the way, and we are not going to try to adjudicate all these details. There's too much of it out there that's just speculation. There's too much that's innuendo. But we're just going to go on the surface of it with what we have in hand from Jeff Bezos and allegedly from AMI. What do you think of the idea of when a newspaper basically comes at you with what was popularly called catch and kill? We've got a story, we'll kill it if the circumstances are right. That the subject of that issue, that scandal, comes right back at him and says, no, I'm going to publish it.
Well, first of all, I think the entire episode besmirches the spotless journalistic record of the National Enquirer. And so that's a blow from which they will never recover. So the question is, is this politically motivated? Bezos is trying to throw himself on the victim pyre and saying that it is. But the National Enquirer has been doing things like this for as long as I've been able to read, it seems to me. Sometimes you'll see stories about, B-17 bomber found on moon or bat child escapes from cave, and sometimes you'll see stories that nobody else will publish, but they happen to be true. So the idea I guess where I'm going with this, Scott, is that the idea that suddenly the National Enquirer turned sleazy because Donald Trump, decided to give him a poke in the ribs, I don't particularly buy.
I don't think that's the primary thing here. The interesting thing is the National Enquirer is allegedly blackmailing or trying to extort this pledge from Jeff Bezos based on the premise that they're defending their journalistic integrity. They want him to publicly come out and say, we did not write a story because of political pressure. And if you don't, we're going to do this kind of sleazy thing of releasing naked selfies of you.
Well, we live in a knife-fighting age, and I don't know if it was ever, certainly it feels like it was more civilized when I was growing up, but I don't know. I don't know what it was like in the 1800s. Mark Twain wrote a short story called, I think it was called Journalism in Tennessee. It's the most hilarious thing I've ever read. But in any event, here's what it seems like to me. Jeff Bezos gets caught and is looking at going from the richest man in the world to being the half richest man in the world, and $100 billion in a divorce settlement. Rather than coming out and saying, geez, I had this incredible moral transgression, I'd like to apologize to my wife for embarrassing her, he says, well, it's politically motivated. Donald Trump's newspaper, the National Enquirer, is coming after me because I published the Washington Post. Well, I don't know what to say about that. Like I said, the National Enquirer has been going after people for quite a long time now. And maybe if you, if you didn't want this to happen, maybe you shouldn't be having an affair with the married woman. That's just my first take on it. But it seems to me that this thing was precipitated by Jeff Bezos going on the offensive when he got caught having an affair.
And he published the whole letter, allegedly, I'm going to say, because he published it, he says it's the letter. He published the whole letter from that attorney that actually chronicled one by one the kinds of pictures that the National Enquirer has in their possession. And very embarrassing stuff, theoretically, for Mr. Bezos. And he basically decided, I'm not going to be, his argument was, if a billionaire like me has to be pressured into, giving in to this kind of extortion, then what happens to the rest of us who don't have billions?
Okay, well, that's, I don't find this a particularly noble stand. I think if it were me, and it's not me, but if there was that kind of evidence against me in this very compromising situation, if it were me, and the story had already broken, certainly I would say, hey, you know what, do your worst, because I don't want to be held prisoner to this for the rest of my life. But what the Enquirer is doing is they're putting kind of kind of underhanded pressure on a guy who did two low and underhanded things. First of all, he cheated on his wife, and secondly, he decided to make it into a political issue where he's the victim of Donald Trump's, secret police state run by the National Enquirer. And I'm not sympathetic to either one of those positions on his part. He slandered, it's hard to believe I'm actually saying this, but he slandered the National Enquirer by saying this was a politically motivated hit piece. No, the National Enquirer is digging through the muck and has been since whenever they were first formed. But this is not like Donald Trump said, you must go after Jeff Bezos because he publishes the Washington Post. I think, as I said, I think it was Bezos acting to go on the offensive when he got caught in a very, 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 very expensive dalliance. And I am not. I'm not saying that what the National Enquirer with that letter did is exactly noble or anything, but I think it's basically fighting Bezos on the level that he decided to take the fight. He's the one that decided to accuse the Enquirer of making this a political thing and not simply accept the responsibility that he got caught cheating on his wife.
Now, as I said, it gets a little tangled here. I mean, the Enquirer did publish an 11 or 12 page expose after a year-long investigation into the infidelity of Mr. Bezos and his paramour, who was married. And so there you have that. But what the National Enquirer is upset about, what David Pecker and AMI are upset about, is that the Washington Post, as well as Mr. Bezos, have basically said that AMI, for want of a better term, has been in the pocket of the Saudis. They apparently published a magazine called The New Kingdom or something like that, and they've been kind of soft peddling things about Saudi Arabia. Now, of course, Washington Post was the home, or at least the home of the freelancer Jamal Khashoggi, who was murdered in the Turkish, allegedly by Turkish forces. And so Bezos, the allegation that National Enquirer is upset about is that Bezos and the Post are saying that AMI is playing nice with the Saudis, and as a result aren't legitimate journalists.
Well, it's funny you mentioned the term legitimate journalist, Scott, because what we have here apparently, when you step back far enough, is a battle between the Washington Post and the National Enquirer. And the question is, which one of them has the most credibility? and I'm going to go with the Enquirer on this one. It's an indication of how far maybe it was never as impartial and as unbiased as we were told that it was. In fact, I'm sure it never was. But this is what happens when you sling mud. Now, look, Donald Trump and the National Enquirer share something in common, in my opinion. They are essentially immune to mudslinging because they've been covered in mud for their entire professional careers. I don't mean that as a term of indictment against either one of them. I'm just saying that both the National Enquirer and Donald Trump have been in this kind of a fight for their entire careers. And it doesn't seem to me that there's much you can do to damage the reputational integrity of the National Enquirer. So the question then becomes, why did Bezos decide to take the Washington Post down to that level? Because that's essentially what he did. If he's basically saying that the Enquirer came after him or is holding this information because the Enquirer is either in the pocket of the Saudis or in the pocket of Trump or both, then what he's done is he's put the reputation of the Washington Post at stake on the altar of his marital infidelities. because he simply couldn't accept that he got caught and said, and was wrong and apologized.
If you're a journalistic ethicist, for want of a better term,
well, that's a rare breed, but yeah,
to see a publisher of the Washington Post stand up and basically say, "Look, I'm being extorted because I will not dial back my accusation that I've made against AMI that they're in the pocket of the Saudis," and I'm using that phrase. They don't use that phrase.
Sure.
So you're basically saying, I am not going to be cowed into rescinding something that I know to be true or that the evidence indicates is true just because they've got some nasty pictures of me. Here, I'm going to publish a list of what these nasty pictures are about and subject myself to additional public opprobrium in the defense of journalistic ethics.
Yeah, so he's not a guy who cheated on his wife in a sleazy manner. He's a champion of freedom. He's a champion of the press. He's a champion of everything that America holds dear. Jeff Bezos is the champion of all of the highest ideologies and morality of the human race. See how it works, Scotty? You see what he did there? He's now the champion of integrity. In fact, that's the exact word I'm looking for. Jeff Bezos, pillar of integrity, will not submit to this pressure on the part of the National Enquirer to admit that he slandered them. Therefore, he's a national hero and not just an adulterer.
Now, if I had heard, 10 years ago, that conservatives were going to stand behind the National Enquirer simply because there was because they're friendly to Trump and the Washington Post is unfriendly to Trump, I never would have believed that the party of values, so to speak, the Republicans, would actually stand up for the sleazy tactics of the National Enquirer. Bill, aren't you afraid that there's no extent to which we will not walk hand in hand with President Trump and his cronies because we like what he's doing?
That's utterly unfair. I'm not standing up for the National Enquirer because they're going after a high-level progressive. I'm not defending the National Enquirer because Donald Trump is involved with it. I'm defending the National Enquirer because in this case they're telling the truth, and the truth is the victim here. And Jeff Bezos understood this completely. By going on to the moral offensive, he's tried everything he can to deflect the fact that it was his behavior that started this whole thing in the first place. You can say what you want to about the National Enquirer. There's no question that the National Enquirer is a muckraker. There's no question about it. You look up muckraking in the dictionary. There's the headline from the National Enquirer. No, I get that completely. But what the National Enquirer does is occasionally since they'll print practically everything, occasionally they'll find something and print something that was actually true. Here's the thing, Jeff. You are not only in the public spotlight, you are the pinnacle of public attention. You are the richest man in the world. The richest man in the world. Well, you were anyway, or you soon will be half of your net worth. And so just as a little tip to you, Jeff, you had the same level of arrogance that Gary Hart did, that John Edwards did, and that everybody else did. You thought that you had the cloak of invisibility wrapped around you because you're a Democrat, you're a high-level donor, you own the Washington Post, everybody's going to wink and just shove this thing under the carpet, and you came up against some people who were sleazy enough to tell the truth. And it's going to cost you hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of billions of dollars. So now that you've realized that since you are the richest man in the world, Jeff, you might want to be careful about your behavior because people are going to be looking at you all the time. You might want to be able to control yourself in a situation like that.
It occurs to me.
Scott, and again, look, it's just crystal clear here. Jeff Bezos said that the charges against me were politically motivated because he got caught committing adultery, and he just simply couldn't say, well, I'm sorry, honey. He simply had those pictures, they were obtained illegally, and Trump is prosecuting me, and he's blackmailing me. Donald Trump didn't put you in that situation. Donald Trump and the National Enquirer didn't write those texts that you sent to your married girlfriend. They didn't do any of that stuff. You did it, Jeff Bezos. You did it. And somebody found out about it, and now you are trying to find a way to cast yourself as the hero when you're not a hero, and you're not a beacon for free speech, and you're not a model of integrity. You're just another adulterer.
Final question, and we got to keep this really short because I've already asked you too many questions. But it occurs to me that at least David Pecker at AMI and the National Enquirer put some stock in the word of the Washington Post, because if they're behind the scenes trying to essentially get a retraction from the Washington Post, they must believe that that hurts their reputation. How is it that somebody like a conservative like David Pecker would even be concerned with it wouldn't have been the greater thing to say, hey, Washington Post is just a fake news outlet. There's no need for us to go behind the scenes and try to blackmail them into retracting?
Calling somebody fake news is a tactic that is often true, and it's bandied around so much that nobody pays much attention to it anymore. But what has happened, whether it's intentional or not, is that the Washington Post and its publisher and the National Enquirer and its publisher are now on a morally even stature. They are now on a morally even level. They are two gladiators down there in the mud and filth, slugging it out with each other. And it is no longer the Washington Post reporting from the lofty heights of Olympus on what is the absolute truth, while the National Enquirer is scurrying down there in the dirt. They're both down there in the dirt. Their credibility of the Washington Post has suffered. And I know we're out of time, but this is a classic example of this game theory where you've got a guy who's driving a $200,000 Lamborghini and another guy who's driving a 1980 Chevy Vega, trying to merge into the same lane. Which one's going to give way first? Well, the guy in the $200,000 car is going to give way first because the guy with the Vega has nothing to lose. His car's all banged to hell anyway. He doesn't care if he gets another collision. And this is what appears to have happened to me. You take the prestige of the Washington Post and use it to defend your own adultery. And what you end up doing is getting into a mudslinging level with the experts of mudslinging, which is the National Enquirer. I'm absolutely happy it happened. Anything to discredit the Washington Post as the arbiter of what needs to be known by the public rather than the presenter of what needs to be known by the public, that makes me happy.
Well, this episode of Bill Whittle Now has been brought to you by the members at BillWhittle.com, who contribute from their own means voluntarily to keep this enterprise afloat, to spread these messages around the world, and to be part of the Citizen Producer team. We're grateful to them. So for Bill Whittle, I'm Scott Ott. Thanks to the members at BillWhittle.com for making this possible.